Good evening, everybody. My name is Alexander Medic and I work for Partos. Partos is the Dutch membership body for Dutch development organizations. And for multiple years, Partos has actively supported the Shift to Power movement, pushing for more equal power relationships within development cooperation. In 2022, Partos launched the Shift to Power Lab 2.0, focusing on co-creating 6 practical solutions to accelerate the change towards more equitable partnerships. 6 working groups of more than 150 development professionals have worked on 6 concrete actions over the past 2 years. One of these working groups focused on developing recommendations towards the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to create a more effective policy framework strengthening civil society. Now, in recent years, space for civil society has been shrinking in countries worldwide. In many countries, CSOs are subject to delegitimization, human rights abuses, imprisonment, reducing their ability to operate. Crucial civic and democratic freedoms are being denied. Against this backdrop of shrinking space for civil society, the relevance of the Dutch policy framework for strengthening civil society in the Global South can hardly be overestimated. The policy enables Dutch CSOs and CSOs from the Global South to join forces in their fight for a just, inclusive, and sustainable world. And although the Dutch policy framework for strengthening civil society is internationally recognized as one of the most progressive of its kind in terms of content and structure, it can also be concluded that there is a mismatch between the ambitions in the progressive policy framework and the actual practice and implementation in reality. It's a learning process. In this meetup, we will present and discuss the recommendations. These recommendations were composed by a group of international experts who have worked tirelessly in the past 2 years to get to the bottom of things and produce the policy paper and also an extensive report with in-depth interviews from every strategic partnership funded under the policy framework strengthening civil society. And I can say it's massively interesting to read all these interviews. Following today's event, we will also embark on a collaborative journey together with our colleagues from the ministry to explore how we can integrate these recommendations in the next policy framework. On a final note, I would also like to bring to your attention the Partos Innovation Festival that will take place on the 13th of October. For registration and more information, you can click on the link that is going to be shared in the chat. For now, I would like to give the word to our facilitator of today, Esther Meester from Wilde Ganzen.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexander, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. But also thank you to many of you for the input that you've provided in the process so far. Today, we will briefly share how the paper was produced, discuss the recommendations, and then also look ahead at next steps, as Alexander was saying. But also today we are launching a complementary publication that further enriches the analysis and the recommendations of the paper, which is very exciting, I think. It's called Voices on Power, and you will hear a lot more about it during this session. If you have read the report with recommendations for the Dutch MFA that have been produced, great. We really look forward to hearing your feedback. If you haven't, but you wanted to, but you're in this session, you haven't had the time to fully read it, no worries. The recommendations will be presented during the session and discussed by various speakers, so you will be brought up to speed. And we would like to do all of this in a high-paced session. There's a lot of content to discuss. So we ask you to share your feedback in the chat with us. The chat will be moderated and saved. And at the end of the session, there will be time for discussion. But we will still also ask your feedback through Mentimeter. Before we dive into the session, it would be great to know who's in the virtual meeting room today. So I'd like to hand over to Sonja for a poll.
Thank you, Esther. So Marijn, if you can share the Mentimeter. Well, we already saw many messages in the chat indicating who you are, which organization are you from, and we want to quickly come to a further understanding who we have in the room right here. So please go to menti.com, either on your phone or in a new web browser. And the first question is, in which country are you based? Well, I already see some responses. The Netherlands, of course, has a high score. What else? South Africa, Turkey. So it's menti.com, and then you enter the code that's on the top of the screen, 27280398. Slowly we see some new countries appearing. Apart from, of course, the Netherlands, we have Germany, we have the UK, Ghana, South Africa, Kenya. Great, thanks. So that's really good to know. I think we are quite an international audience. So Marijn, I think we can go to the next question. So if you haven't entered the Menti yet, please do so now, and you can join us in this quick survey. So what type of organizations do you represent? NGOs, 25 answers already, 26, goes up as we speak. And then, well, university, one person, government, one person, and well, some consultants among our group. And then there's one other. Well, I'm curious to know what that is. So if you're willing to reveal yourself, please post it in the chat. But it's good to see that well, that there are many NGOs and present. And Paul of Coordinate says, well, there's no shrinking space for CSOs here, and that's indeed good to see. So thank you all. The next question. Is your organization part of a consortium under the policy framework Strengthening Civil Society? And it already seems that most of you are part of one of the partnerships. So many of the NGOs present here do participate in one of the consortia. 9 or 10 are not part of it, and 7 don't know, but well, I am sure that all present here do have some interest or some stake in this discussion. So welcome everybody again. Marijn, I think that was the last question of this intro block, or do we have another one?
Yes, that was the last one.
Okay, so it's good to know who we have in the room with this small survey, and then also all the messages in the chat you put there to present yourself. So then I hand it over back to Esther. Up to you, Esther.
Thank you, Sonja. Yes, we will. I'd like to give the floor to Heinz Schrein, who's the author of the paper with a very long title. It's Recommendations for a More Power-Balanced and Effective Policy Framework Strengthening Civil Society, as well as Marijke Priester. It's always difficult to pronounce the Dutch name when you're speaking English. Author of the new report, Voices on Power, and they will both take us along on the process of the past couple of months. Heinz, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I think calling me the author of the paper is a bit too much. Maybe I've been holding the pen for most of the time, but there have been many people who made inputs and delivered text for making this policy paper. Let me just tell you a little bit about the background. Alexander was already referring to the launch of the Partos Innovation Lab in May 2022. But before we started with the Innovation Lab, we had already quite a long period of thinking about power relationships. And we were thinking, you know, how is it possible that these power relationships, these unbalanced power relationships between NGOs in the north and NGOs in the south, that they have been so unbalanced for a long time. And although nobody agrees with it, there's no change. There's very little change. So we try to understand why that is the case. And we didn't want to focus on the entire aid system. We thought that was that unit of analysis would be too big. So we decided to focus on the power relations that emerged from the current Dutch policy framework for strengthening civil society. So we're talking about a program of 42 strategic partnerships with a total budget of 1.3 billion euros, which started, I think, in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and which will end in 2025. And then we hope that there will be a successor of this policy framework. Why do we hope that that is the case? Is because that everybody really likes this policy. But we also agree it's not perfect. So we have been analyzing this system for a long time. And in May 2022, when we decided to launch the Partos Innovation Lab, we decided to stop the phase of analysis and now start moving into action and make an effort to change the system. So that's where these 6 action lines were also launched as part of the Partos Innovation Lab. Now, 5 of these action lines, they really focus on what the CSOs can do themselves to change the system. And this action 1 that we're talking about today is about, what is within the span of the control of the ministry to change the system. So we don't expect that the ministry will change the system, but the ministry is definitely one of the actors who can contribute to this change. And that's what we are focusing on today. Now, our main question is what is needed to make the successor of this very successful policy framework, how to make it better than the current one that we have. So when we started drafting in May 2022, it was a long process and we were working in a small group, but we presented our paper on the 29th of March this year. And this meeting, it was an online workshop, and we got a lot of feedback and also many new ideas, which we incorporated in this new draft, in these draft recommendations. So today we present you the final product that is a co-creation of many people, and our recommendations focus on 4 areas in which we see shortfalls in the current policy framework, and that is about agenda and priority setting, about managing risks, about accountability, and about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And in this program today, these 4 subject areas will be introduced to you one by one. I leave it at this. Back to Esther. Thank you.
Thank you, Heinz. Marijke. You're muted, Marijke.
Sorry. Voices on Power, it's going to be released today, an important additional initiative by Partos to give space to the views of the Southern colleagues in the partnerships. Maybe you can show the slides and you will have an idea of how it will look like, this publication. So in the middle, you see the cover of the publication. Thank you. That's the cover. It's in the new Partos style, I heard. So it's was proud to be the first publication that is designed like this. And you see a lot of names on both sides. And these are all the interviews that we did, because it's 28 interviews, 1 interview with a person from 1 partnership, 21 Power of Voices partnerships, and 7 SRHR Fund partnerships. We asked the lead organizations to put someone forward, not to represent, but to get to know personal views and observation and ideas. And that has worked very well. We have a complementary report now. I know that in Partos they were a bit shocked by the volume in the beginning, because it's around 100 pages, 1 person per partnership. Imagine if more people were involved, so it could have been even more. Please remove the slide, because I think you have had a view, and it will be released today, I think. But all the material that we collected in the interviews, I think it's the best evidence to object what I regularly hear here in the so-called global north, that we We don't hear the so-called Global South express what they want. We come up here in the North with so many ideas on Southern leadership, on shifting the power, on system change. But where is the Global South? Where are the ideas? But I think that maybe our eagerness here to come up with all these concepts is exactly the problem, implying that we should focus here more on listening. It seems a very big cliche, but I think for many in the North, this is really the most difficult thing to do. But if you do listen, you will find that the ideas are there, and that the criticism is there, that the criticism is also fair and also including honest self-criticism. Well, I had the privilege with these interviews to listen for, well, at least 30 hours and ask questions now and then. And the conversations were open and frank and reflecting outstanding knowledge, also on the wider scope of the Global South, on the political economic situation in the North, and the relationship with the ministry, with the embassies, and with the Northern partners. I wrote each interview down in consent with the interviewees until we were both satisfied about the end result. And also the introduction and the concluding section of the report, they were submitted to them before they were made final. And one thing is clear, I think Heinz already said it, but it also comes up in the interviews. The importance of the Dutch framework to strengthen civil society is really beyond dispute, also among the organization in the Global South. And in a world of many different funders, the Dutch ministry ranks relatively high to very high in terms of progressive policies, the length of the grant period, and relative flexibility. So all of them said in the interviews, this has to stay, but there is also improvement that can be done. I think it's nice of this report that the language is a spoken language. It's informal and it's clear. The message is not hidden behind theoretical concepts, but it comes from a daily lived reality. It makes it also a book of stories. And I think storytelling undoubtedly supports social change. It creates also openings to overcome the barriers between the Global South and North. And I think this report is a good example. The messages are perhaps not always the messages that we like to hear in the North, but again, they are fair and they will need a conversation. So I hope these conversations will be there. That's also why the report ends with a concluding section that is called Some Topics Worth a Good Conversation. And this can be a talk in or among the Northern CSOs, Southern with Northern CSOs, among Southern CSOs, and not to forget, I think, of Southern CSOs also with the ministry. And today we have 5 interviewees with us, among them one of the 2 Southern leads in the partnerships. And they will react, as Heinz also said, on the 4 central topics in the recommendation papers and share also some further ideas. And yeah, I can't resist, I have to say, the small but important detail is that 2 of them will do this in a video message, because it is difficult and even impossible for one of them to participate in this event, given the time zone they are in. A clear illustration that time zones also hinder equal participation, and I think we really should be very mindful about it. So I invite you to dive into the Voices of Power. The publication will be soon on the Partos website, and I'm sure it will light some bulbs it will lead to some light bulbs in your head in relation to the recommendations paper, but also beyond. And just one example, and then I'll stop. The observation by one interviewee really keeps me busy. That we can ask ourselves if a call, the call that will come out again in 2025, is really the right instrument to come to a selection of programs to strengthen civil society. Because here, killing competitiveness is leading. And there is a risk that was mentioned by quite some interviewees, that applicants are inclined, as they said, to sing the song of the funder, instead of focusing on issues asserted by the communities on the ground. Okay, lots of food for thought. I go back here to Esther. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marijke. And indeed, the report looks beautiful, and I know the content is really worth reading. So thank you very much for that. We will now dive into the recommendations as put forward by the paper. Heinz already mentioned the 4 areas. Once again, we do this in the spirit of partnership and appreciation for the strengths of the policy framework strengthening civil society. It's very commendable in many ways. Various speakers have already touched on that, so I will not repeat it. And we are well aware that all of us need to do some deep self-reflection on attitudes, policies, practices to really see the change, systemic change that we envision to really fundamentally change power dynamics who are so deeply rooted in colonialism. So we are well aware of that. Today we focus on what we feel the Dutch MFA's policy framework can contribute to that, to strengthen that more enabling environment for genuine partnerships. Each set of each area will be presented by a member of the working group, so the issues identified and the recommendations, and then one of the a representative from a partnership will respond to those recommendations. After that, we will ask you to respond through a Mentimeter. So we will go through 4 areas, and the first area is agenda setting, agenda and priority setting. If you could share the slide, please, Sonja. I will be the first person to present the recommendations. Yeah. And I think the issue identified here is that priority setting is dominantly done in the north, in the Netherlands in this case. I think the issues identified are rather straightforward. So in the interest of time, I will not go through them in detail, but focus on the recommendations. And in the paper, you will read that it is recommended to really put into practice the starting from the south principle and also subsidiarity. So which means as much as those closest to the envisioned change have as much ownership and decision-making power about the work. We feel that it's really important if the framework could focus on complementarity of roles. So what are the different roles assumed by different types of actors in the partnership? For example, what is the role of the Dutch organization and why is the Dutch organization best placed to assume that role? What is the legitimacy of different types of organizations and partners? Who is their constituency and how do they engage with them? What is the role of local resources, knowledge, expertise, money that is available, and how can the external resources build on that? Furthermore, we feel the consultation process can be really strengthened in various ways to make it much more meaningful by increasing the time between, and this still assumes a call for proposals, and we are well aware that that's not ideal and it strengthens competition. But if there is a call for proposal, it would be recommended to really increase the time to design the program and to also move part of the design to an inception consultation phase in the first year when we are no longer in a situation of competition, of not being certain whether we will access the money, but to really do more deep, meaningful consultation, and also for the donor to provide resources for that. To also enable smaller organizations to really invest in consultation processes. The paper recommends to extend the program period from 5 to 10 years, recognizing that the change that we work on is long-term change. It's complex work, and there's only so much that you can actually achieve in 5 years. So it would be much better to acknowledge that, take time for that. And also it's recommended to make a stronger connections with other funding programs that support CSOs in other roles. In other words, to connect the lobbying and advocacy work to other roles of civil society organizations to strengthen their legitimacy in doing the lobbying and advocacy. I'll leave it there. I'll hand over to Josh Ogada. Welcome, Josh. Josh is the head of knowledge management at South North, based in South Africa. And South North is part of the partnership Voices for Just Climate Action. Josh, I invite you to respond to these recommendations.
Thank you very much. And I do realize that the time is very short, so I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. I think broadly, so to speak, the key thing here that comes out for us is the bridging the gap between intentionality and meeting expectations. So one of the things that, for example, was important to us is the idea of true consultation. When you have consultations, is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or whichever funder actually willing and able to listen to very difficult questions? We are speaking about expanding civic space and for civil society to be able to speak. So is there receptiveness to answering very, very difficult questions? I think on another note, in a very broad context, one of the things that stood out was aid policy versus foreign policy, where countries, whether it be the Dutch government or any other funder government, has got a clear international development policy, and that we should understand that it's not benevolent aid, but it's actually self-interest based, even if it's enlightened self-interest. So that, again, that also calls for a radical level of honesty and openness in terms of discussions around what is possible and what is not possible. Of course, recognizing that we are having this discussion within a broader context of, the colonial legacy, dysfunctional power relationships that exist between the global North and the global South. But at least I think within this space where there's been an intention to change those relationships, the least we can do is have a radical level of honesty and openness in order for us to move forward. In terms of the upside down agenda setting, I think this is hugely important, but again, questions of, which way aid flows, recognizing that even in countries that, for example, the Voices for Just Climate Action program is operating, these are countries where the Dutch government has got clear foreign policy and priorities. And sometimes it's important to check if there is actually a match between the foreign interests, the foreign policy interest of the Dutch government versus whatever program we are rolling out. In terms of broadening the scope of the work, we are finding, for example, that some of the types of work that have been excluded based on the policy within our program are key catalytic factors in us being able to push the idea of, increasing the advocacy role. So there is work that is catalytic to broadening the advocacy space, whether it be service delivery, whether it's civic education. So I think thinking of a broader corollary of work that helps to create an enabling environment for the rolling out of these programs becomes important. And I suppose finally is the idea of time frame. I mean, I think we are living with the experience of that. I mean, 5 years is, in the broader scope of things, is a generous period of time, but we are finding that in year 3 or 5, we are only now starting to consolidate the enabling environment and starting to roll out and implement. And if there is any possibility or consideration around lengthening the timeframes of these programs, that would something that would definitely be able to work, because otherwise then you end up with a program whose impacts are so far in the future that it's difficult to establish causality and the rest. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I think that really deepens and underlines what you just said, underlines the recommendations of the paper. So thank you for those insights. Sonia, you have a poll for us.
Yeah, thank you, Marijn. So what we're going to do is we go to the same Menti.com site with the same code which you see on top of the screen. And we want to ask you to rate the 6 recommendations under agenda and priority setting that you see on the screen. So the ranges go from not important to on the left-hand side to very important on the right-hand side. So the first is a call for proposals that focus on complementary roles. Sorry, can you mute yourself, I think, Carrie? Legitimacy, local resources, and the thorough consultation process. I see people are already voting. So if we look at the first one, you can see that, well, there's a tendency for this recommendation to be found very important, or at least somehow important. If you haven't voted yet, please do so, also for the other recommendations. There's not really a recommendation that comes out as not important to you. Most of them, also number 2, increase the time between launch of call for concept notes and submission deadline to 6 months. Well, that's a bit hard to see. It has an average of 2.8, and yeah, most of the people find that very important or somehow important, and that it's a similar picture for number 3, introduce inception and consultation phase of 1 year. Yeah, and for the others, provide resources for adequate consultation, extend program period for 5 to 10 years, and make stronger connections with funding programs that support CSOs in other roles. So, well, it's good to see that, yeah, all of these recommendations for like the largest part of this audience are seen as very important. I see there's a question in the chat. I'm unclear what 6 means. Heinz, could you maybe very briefly explain that one? What is meant with make stronger connection with funding programs that support CSOs in other roles other than lobbying and advocacy?
Yeah, well, as you may know, the current policy focuses especially on this role of CSOs in their capacity as organizations that are active in lobbying and advocacy. But that's not the only thing that CSOs are doing, and I think that may not be even the most important thing from which they get their legitimacy. So the idea is that CSOs might benefit to also being supported in the other roles that they are performing, and why they are appreciated by the people who are part of that society. Now, we didn't want to say that the policy has to focus equally on other things, but the policy could try to establish linkages between other programs that are not necessarily focusing on lobbying and advocacy, but that are also helping CSOs to perform those other important roles that they have, maybe more towards in the direction of delivering services or those kind of things. So that's what we wanted to indicate with this recommendation number 6.
Thank you, Heinz. Well, overall, we see that the first is scoring highest on importancy, and then the second, well, a little bit lower, but still it's well, interesting to see. And also there are some people that have indicated that one of these recommendations is not very important. So we also would like to know more about the reason why. So here with the invitation to also put that shortly in the chat, just for us to be aware. Well, that's all for now. So thanks, Marijn, for sharing. And then we go on with the next element.
Yes. Thank you, Sonja. And please feel free to put any feedback or thoughts in the chat. We will now move on with the second area, which is accountability. And I will hand over to Heinz, who will present the issues and recommendations.
Thank you. Can we have a look at the sheet with the presentation? Yes. And we need to scroll down. Accountability, yes, this is the one. So the intention of the policy is to have balanced power relations. That is clearly stated in the first part of the policy paper of the ministry. But the accountability mechanism, and especially the financial accountability mechanism, seems to work in a different direction. There is a focus that works in a vertically upward direction of accountability. And this is because the policy prescribes that the lead party is accountable to the ministry on behalf of all partners. And as we know, in most cases, the lead party is an organization from the north. I think of the 22 partnerships, there are only 2 partnerships that are led by a southern partner. And in the policy, we have also explained why that is the case. It's not so easy for a southern partner to become the lead party in these consortia. A second reason why this accountability works upwards is because the lead party is also supposed to sign annual agreements with the other partners. And in these agreements, it's stipulated that the lead party decides about the allocation of resources. Now, this way, the ministry becomes like a client at the top, demanding services from the lead party as a contractor. And the lead party, on his turn, becomes like a client demanding services from the other partners as like subcontractors. And although in practice, I think in the partnerships, people are really trying to smoothen these very sharp edges of this policy, but it's still a false start, which resonates through the entire duration of the partnership. And the second issue with the accountability mechanism is that it's extremely complicated, very time-consuming, and this also contributes to tension between the lead party and the other partners. So the recommendations that we have come up with is first, explore how horizontal and downward accountability can be stimulated by the framework. We don't have yet clear-cut solutions how that can be done, but we need to explore this together. There is the idea to make the accountability mechanisms workable for lead parties and consortium partners and accountants, so far less complex than they are now. And what would also help is that we start developing these the accountability mechanism of the next policy framework in a much earlier stage, because now the rules for accountability were published not even after the call, but even sometimes during the implementation of the programs. And that makes it's already complex, but that makes it completely unworkable. So these are the 3 recommendations that we came up with. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much, Heinz. Isaac Diamfi. Isaac is the regional director of the Solidaridad Office for West Africa. He's based in Ghana and part of the partnership Reclaim Sustainability. Isaac, I'd like to invite you to respond to these observations and recommendations.
Thank you very much, Esther. I think Heinz has nailed it on the head, as we said. Clearly, within a few minutes, you cannot touch on every aspect of accountability-related issues. Even beyond finance, there are still accountability issues, but I think he summarized it quite well. One area that from practice I want to comment on is the recommendation around creating progressively a more balanced accountability between the Southern CSOs and the Global North CSOs and the ministry, and invariably also with the local governments, because CSOs, our responsibility includes working and facilitating government's efforts to develop the rural communities, national economies. So in terms of accountability, we need to begin thinking of a matrix that allows us to triangulate also with governments, national governments in the southern countries, making them also jointly accountable to the global north by ensuring that the resources dispensed by civil society in the development space is addressing exactly what they want to see as national systems in terms of their national development aspirations. And the matrix must also allow the North to also demand that accountability from the South, because it's all linked to the different elements of this conversation if we set an agenda together, then we are jointly accountable for whatever we set out in the agenda, albeit finance or targets or what have you. So I think that's an area that we would like to see more exploration. We're not asking for national governments to control resources coming from the global north in the way they want, but if they are part of the conversation in defining the agenda, then when it comes to accountability, we must see a horizontal connection with, say, the Ministry of Finance, the National Development Planning Commissions, and the total outputs must also feed in the accountability matrix to the global north and then vice versa. And I think when we're able to ensure that triangulation in the accountability matrix, we'll be creating a more progressive balance when it comes to power relating to accountability.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting perspective on the different types of accountability that could be explored. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Sonja, another Mentimeter.
Yes, there it comes. So we will go through the same exercise again regarding the recommendations on accountability. So please all go back to the Mentimeter and we'll start entering your score, your sense of whether this is important or not. For the 3 recommendations, I already see well, some scores appearing. The first one, explore how horizontal and or downward accountability can be stimulated by the framework. Well, there are people giving that a score of 2, 3, and most of you say 4, so very important. And the same goes for number 2, make accountability mechanisms workable for lead parties, other consortium partners, and accountants, which scores equally high, somewhat as the first one, a 3.7. So that's fairly, almost very important. With nobody saying for well, the first, the second, and also the third, nobody who says that's really not important. Looking at the last one, start developing the accountability mechanism in early stage and publish before the start of the tender process. It scores a bit lower than the other ones, a 3.2, with 4 people saying that this is not really important or not so important. And then 5 saying, well, somewhere in the middle. And then, well, most of them are on the right side, but it's interesting to see that this is clearly the one that is sensed as, well, being a little bit less important than the other 2, even though it is appreciated. So again, the invitation to, well, put your thoughts and your feelings about these recommendations in the chat. Also, well, if you don't think they're like particularly important or you have some thoughts about them, so please share them. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonja, and thank you, Heinz and Isaac, for briefly talking about this. I think it's a subject that so many things can be said about. Obviously, this time is too short. There's more thoughts on it in the paper, but also, again, post your thoughts in the chat. Laurie has made a really good point in the chat about risk sharing, and this is a great bridge to our next subject, which is managing risks. And I'd like to invite Paul van den Berg of Coordate to present the issues and recommendations.
Yes, thank you, Esther. And indeed, Laurie made a very good bridge to the next topic. And I think accountability and risk or risk sharing is sort of connected, but we made in the report a specific chapter on risk because it was seen as quite crucial. Because, yeah, lobbying advocacy, especially in fragile contexts, contains risks, but already developing programs in these contexts have risks. And maybe you can also put on the sheet, Sonja, again. Yeah. This is accountability, but risk is the next one. It's a bit delay. Yeah, so what we see is that, well, obviously, yeah, we're talking here about the taxpayers' money, and it makes a lot of sense, of course, that the ministry, as the back donor, wants to manage risks, because, yeah, if things go wrong, they of course run into problems, because this is money from the Dutch people. But we see that the way risks are being managed is, well, basically pushing the risk down the chain. So there's a contract between the ministry and the lead agency, which, as was already said by Heinz, in the current generation of strategic partnerships is often the Northern organization. And that organization then pushes the risks to the other consortium partners and also to the local and national NGOs. So this transfer of leads from the ministry to the lead party to the other organizations in a strategic partnership is not very helpful, to say the least. What is also not helpful is the fact that the Dutch partners select the southern partners instead of the other way around. So it's a very sort of top-down process, which again is fitting the Dutch system of accountability and risk management, but it's not in the spirit of shifting the power, right? That's you should actually start in the countries with the southern organizations, and ideally they should then sort of make the selection of the organizations involved, including Northern organization. But the whole system is not really designed to cater for that. What is extra complicating is that, well, working in very volatile settings is even more difficult in the current setup. So in insecure environments and risks are sort of natural partners, but yeah, managing risks there is challenging, and yeah, the risk mitigation system is not very much in place. So what we see is, fortunately, we think that in the thinking about the next generation partnerships, it's not necessary to start from scratch, because in the humanitarian scene, already quite interesting developments are taking place. And the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually part of that. They have stimulated research on risk sharing in the humanitarian sector. So also as part of the so-called grand bargain thinking, grand bargain commitments. So we think that looking at these recommendations and the way risks are equally shared between the ministry and implementing organizations is already a good thing to do. So taking the best practices from that sector is already helpful. And yeah, maybe sort of open door, but moving from protocol and bureaucracy to dialogue is also very helpful. So not sort of pushing all the bureaucracy on the organization that are part of the strategic partnerships, but really start with the dialogue and start with good consultation processes in order to make sure that that risks are equally shared. So I'll leave it here. Back to you, Esther.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Paul. We will now watch a video with a reaction by Carla Lopez Cabrera. She's the executive director of the Fondo Centroamericano de Mujeres, one of the southern-based organizations that are lead party for the partnership. They are part of GAGA, the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action.
Hello, I'm Carla Lopez, co-director of the Central American Women's Fund, FECAM. FECAM is the lead of the Global Alliance for Women and Gender Action, GAGA, which is a partnership with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was asked to react to the recommendations made to the about the issue management, the risk management. Sorry. And the points shared before resonate with our experience as the lead organization of the GAGA program. And as an organization based in the Global South, I want to emphasize on the last issue, Designing a program that is open to work with organizations in the Global South in the framework of a partnership requires more than political will. Indeed, it requires an intention translated as a change in the system and in the mindset, because our contexts are completely different, and the measures that are common or normal or work in the Dutch context, such having your financial information publicly available because it's the way to show transparency, it can be unthinkable for some of us because of the security issues. That doesn't mean the lack of transparency and the lack of a robust accountability system. With regards of the recommendation, I completely agreed with the principle stated. Risk is inherent to the work we do and the places we and our partners work and are based. And the reason we exist is to ensure that organizations advancing human, climate, and environmental rights in very restrictive contexts can have access to resources and accompaniment to continue their vital work in the best conditions possible, including preserving their life and integrity. In this sense, I want, once again, to stress the need for a constant and open dialogue with the ministry so it can be closer to our reality in the Global South and have a deep understanding that the risk goes beyond the financial resources involved. We totally understand and agreed on the compliance when such big programs are involved, but we question if that needs to be translated in a relationship that oftentimes can be purely contractual. The way risk is handled is only focused on legal aspect, reputation, and audits. The ministry wants us to avoid risk as much as possible, so do we, but the risk in the framework of this partnership is immediately related to lose money. But in GAGA, we have a more holistic way to see and manage risk. We have a clear commitment with transparency and accountability, but at the same time, we are committed to stand up and taking care of our partners and ourselves because we live in a daily risky context. The risk management that is put on the shoulder of us and as the lead could easily influence the relationship with our partners into a contractual one. That's the reason why for GAGA, this implies also other practices like solidarity, companionship, close communication, flexibility, and the relationship among us and with our local, and the relationship of among us and with our local partners. We build a close relationship that goes beyond a grant contract. We have created a program that allows people and organizations to have or feel ownership with, guaranteeing the success and accountability of the program and the community we have built is a collective commitment, implemented through a close relationship, open communication, and participatory processes. We would like to ask attention for this aspect of the partnership and trust in relation to the risk in the discussion paper. Shifting power requires such thinking beyond financial aspect, is let the control go and to think the relationship from others' perspective, is the work ups and down. And we know sometimes can be scary, can be terrifying. But once you are on board, it's excited and you'll see the world is full of possibility. We would love to be part of the conversation with the FMA and Partos members about other approaches for risk management, sharing risk, as the presentation state, and shifting power. Thank you.
That was a very strong plea for rethinking risk management and also looking at other aspects, especially in adverse contexts. We would like to ask you again how you feel about the recommendations, how important they are to you. And if you miss any recommendations, please put them in the chat, but indicate in the Mentimeter how important these two are to you.
Yeah, so please go to the same Mentimeter and enter the way you feel about these two recommendations. So I see the scores for both recommendations. The first one, apply recommendations from research into risk sharing in the humanitarian relief sector. And also the second, move from protocol and bureaucracy to dialogue. I see them going up. The second one a bit more. There's really the vast majority that says, well, this is at least, well, quite important up to like very important. The biggest part. In terms of the first one, scores are a bit lower. So, well, I guess even some, two people that really are more on the left-hand side of this recommendation. So I can imagine there are very many reasons for that. So, well, looking at time, again, the invitation to clarify your thoughts in the chat. Very curious to know why you scored the way you did. And thank you, Marijn. So back to you, Esther.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, Carla, and also Laurie for your input in the chat on this topic. I hope you're still with us. We're going to move to the last area of the last set of recommendations, which is about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And Heinz will present the recommendations.
Thank you.
Slow, but here it comes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for the slide, when I was presenting the recommendations about accountability, I already referred to this client-contractor relationship between the ministry and the CSOs. This also applies to monitoring and evaluation, which is also biased towards upward accountability. The ministry is very eager to have an upward flow of monitoring data that can be fed into the IATI system. And there is an emphasis on generating quantifiable data, but the use and the accuracy of these data is to most people very unclear. Very few see the benefit of this system from a learning and program steering perspective. And when we had our feedback meeting in March about the draft recommendations, many participants were very outspoken about this. They did not see why IATI was so useful, and they didn't get any feedback from the system. So it was just like a machine in which data are being fed, but there's nothing coming out. That's an issue. Another issue is that outcome harvesting as a method of evaluating programs. It's the preferred method for many partnerships because they consider it very useful for learning and program steering purposes, but it is discouraged by the ministry. So because programs want to learn and because they need to learn in order to have their steering in place, they are forced to establish parallel track M&E systems, one for being accountable and the other one for learning and program steering. Now, you can imagine that by having two parallel systems, the workload is becoming excessively high for partnerships when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. So we formulated 4 recommendations to solve this, to include clear guidelines for joint decision-making between the ministry and the consortia on monitoring and evaluation. Now we believe that there's too much decision-making on the part of the ministry without proper consultation. We recommend to include guidelines to ensure that all M&E objectives are being met, so not only accountability, but also learning and steering. And there should also be, that's the third recommendation, there should be proportionality between the time and effort costs invested in generating data and the use value of these data. And that use value should be determined through a dialogue that leads to joint decision-making about a good M&E system. And last but not least, we believe it's time to evaluate IATI, especially also in the framework of this idea of proportionality. These are the 4 recommendations that we came up with regarding monitoring, evaluation, and learning.
Thank you, Heinz. I'd like to invite Esther Niawera. She's the network coordinator of FemNet, an organization in Kenya, which is part of the She Leads consortium. Esther, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you, Heinz, for sharing the recommendations and the findings from the M&E. Mine is just to add, of course, I agree with you on the issue of IATI. It's really from the perspective of from a point of somebody who is on the one who is reporting. I think it's really difficult for us to work with IATI because the system is not responsive and all that. And I think it needs to be reevaluated. In addition to what you have mentioned, I think it is also important for us to focus on strengthening the capacities of those who are reporting. Oftentimes, M&E is very technical, and the people that are required to report, they do not have that technical capacity. But also it's because they do not have enough resources to recruit, for instance, monitoring and evaluation people. Some of the people the organizations that are required to report are, for instance, girl-led organizations who are struggling to have resources and full-time people to do the work that they are doing. And so I think it's very important that we focus on capacity strengthening so that also the communities can be able to report. And in addition to that, we also need to simplify the M&E process. I think from the baseline to everything that goes into monitoring, evaluation, and learning, it's even difficult for the technical people. Sometimes you ask them questions and they don't understand, or they are also confused because it's very, very broad, from IATI to outcome harvesting to setting targets and all that. It's broad. Can it be, changed? And we also look at it from a social change perspective, because if you look at the theory of change, it's simple. We understand it. We can we can identify with it because that is what is happening in the community. But then when it comes to reporting, that is another whole ballgame. And so those two do not match. And we also want to recommend that after reporting to MOFA, what happens? What's next? And then that's just reporting one way to MOFA, and how do we also report to the communities where we work? I think that's something that we often miss. And lastly, usually MOFA has, I don't know whether it's there in other consortiums, but in our consortium, the She Leads, we are supposed to have a learning agenda. And most times network members are always asking, why do we have to have a different learning agenda which requires additional actions and additional resources to learn? Why can't we incorporate learning in the other activities or the main activities that we do? And so those are some of the things that I would want to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. And I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, that it's sometimes difficult. We use the term in our partnership, measuring what matters. So what matters to everybody involved, including communities, and how do we then integrate that, balance it with the indicator framework that we developed at the start of the program. So I thought there was a lot that I could relate to in what you just said. And thank you for that. Sonia, could you please launch the Mentimeter?
Yes, so let's look at this last set of recommendations regarding monitoring, evaluation, and learning. It's the last set, but really not the least important. There was a lot of richness, I think, also in these presentations. So please, start voting. And while you do so, again, I realize that whenever somebody says that something is not important or just a little bit important, it might have to do with the content of the recommendation, but also with maybe the way it's formulated or your feeling whether this is realistic or not. So please leave also your messages in the chat again. Yeah, I see that most of those 4 recommendations have kind of an average of 3. The first one, 2.8, include clear guidelines for joint decision-making between the ministry and consortia on MEL. So it's a bit, I see that here, at least the 4.2 are a bit below, like average, looking also at the previous sets, although still going up. The second scores at 2.9, a bit higher, include guidelines to ensure that all M&E objectives are being met, including accountability, learning, and steering. The third one, well, for the scores I see now, it seems it's rated as the most important of this set, a 3.5. It's about including in policy that the time, effort, and costs invested in generating data is proportionate to the use value of these data. And and then the last one, 3.1, regarding the use of IATI, it's also rated as, well, fairly important. Okay, again, it's difficult to guess like why we see the scores like this. And I think at the end of this session, there's also some time, well, to discuss and have a dialogue about these recommendations or also the previous sets. But interesting to see. So thanks again. And back to you, Esther.
Thank you, Sonja. While this was the last area of recommendations, we have one more video for you. It's a video of Ruth Canlis. She's executive director of, and I'll read this, the Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program based in the Philippines, part of the Green Livelihoods Alliance. And she will respond to the aspects of Southern leadership within the Dutch-funded partnerships.
I think it was a laudable initiative in the Dutch ministry to pay attention to Southern leadership in the current framework. The question is, how prepared are the Southern partners to be part of that leadership? The reality is that we are used to being receivers and not the decision makers for programs. It can be a problem when you are suddenly put into that position, being part of the application and the whole process if you are not prepared to do so. Preparedness would include knowing how the whole Dutch funding application works, the policy implications, and the financial implications as well. For the current funding framework, we sorely missed an inception phase. In our new position as alliance partner, we needed to come up with a theory of change in all the countries we're working, a baseline, and at the same time, we needed to implement the program at the community level. We had to do all this aside from getting the consent of the communities we work with. Because of the missing inception phase, worsened by COVID that prohibited us from going to the communities, I think we were not able to do the baseline and community consultations to the extent that was needed. And of course, that impacted on the whole plan. Plus, we immediately had to implement and come up with reports. I hope the idea of leading from the Global South will be taken further in the next framework. Maybe the ministry could consider some criteria in terms of the ratio between the number of Southern and Northern Alliance partners. In GLA, we pushed for 3 Southern Alliance partners because there were already 3 Dutch organizations at that level. The ratio counts because it should never be a token representation. As for the budget, GLA did not get the amount it needed to fully implement the program as envisioned. The 3 Dutch partners had a larger share in the budget. As for the 3 Southern partners and the gender technical partner, we divided the remaining fund equally among us, of course, less the global coordination budget. All partners agreed on this division. I understand how difficult it is for the Dutch organizations to have lower budget. They're used to their own way of working with the earlier budget in mind. If they would have substantial budget cuts, that might be difficult for them to make the necessary adjustments. Plus, they also have partners at the country level to deal with. As for us, as we were just coming in and not yet familiar with the extent of the work, we had to make do with what we had. But of course, with a larger budget, that could have been avoided. So the challenge is really for the ministry. The ministry encouraged us to include Southern partners at the same level as the Dutch partners. The whole idea of leading from the South. Bringing in more partners means providing more budget. We understand that some costs like salaries in the Netherlands are not the same as ours, but we are also now taking on new and different roles. Not only the implementing role in the different countries, there should be budget for that. Now, because of limited budget, we have to take on wear different hats. It takes a toll for us, for a lot of people to do that. If the ministry really values more Southern ownership, and if they want to empower Southern organizations, they should add more budget. It is needed because, as I said, the Southern organizations have new roles to play at the alliance level, including decision-making. I believe we also need accompanying capacity building to fulfill these roles adequately. Thank you.
A very clear message from Ruth, with a strong plea that changing roles also requires adequate resources. We have come to the end of the presentations. Thank you all to all presenters and contributors. And we would like to move on to an open discussion of what we've heard so far, what has been discussed so far. I see, Laurie, you have put on a lot of very on-point comments and feedback in the chat. Would you like to mention or elaborate a bit further? I hope I'm not catching you off guard.
No. It's not a problem, Esther. Hi, everyone. I'm Laurie from Just Associates, Southern-led organization leading the Power Up Consortium, funded by the Power of Women Strategic Partnership. Now, I think I do agree with Paul's point that there's a thin line between risk sharing and accountability, because, you know, in the aid chain, we always see the donor as free of risks and less accountable, the one who's imposing accountability. So I think it's good to also emphasize that, hopefully, in the report. And also this whole idea of program period. What does it mean for high impact, high risk impact groups, like, you know, supporting LGBTQI groups or minority groups that are highly discriminated in hostile settings? Even beyond the program period, they are still facing the same risk, or it could be heightened because there's no form of protection that is present anymore in that locality or in that area where, we know, within the program period, INGOs on the donor is still present. So this idea of program period, I hope that it broadens also when we broaden the definition of risk, that we could also look at how risk is being experienced by those who are really, you know, on a day-to-day life, they are facing this safety and protection risk on a day-to-day basis. And also on Mel, we have a feminist Mel session with Partos, so hopefully everybody would like to look at that side of the story of, you know, funding women's rights organization and feminist movements, and how feminist principles on adopting Mel is quite important to us beyond these technocratic requirements that we're all busy at with this strategic partnership. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurie. I see that Orlando posted a question in the chat. How do the recommendations address intrinsic inequalities within countries and societies in the so-called global south? With a number of examples. Orlando, would you like to introduce yourself and elaborate on your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, thank you very much, Esther. And Lori was taking a very important point with discrimination. And okay, my name is Orlando Coronado Fernandez. I am Peruvian. I am living in the Netherlands. I am working as a volunteer for PUMP, it's an organization in The Hague. We work with experts all around the world, and I have quite experience in international development. And in my experience in Latin America, especially, we always complain about the inequality between the north and the global south, so-called. And but in my experience, we don't see too much, and we don't pay too much attention to the inner inequalities, to the intrinsic inequalities systems in the countries. There are the same inequalities that we can see since European countries in relation to developing nations can be replicated and extended in the countries. Not only in the gender issues, but indigenous communities, depending on sexual orientation, economical inequalities, and so on. So my question is related to how these recommendations address these issues. If are relevant for us, or we just see the country that we want to work with as a package, and we don't see what is going inside.
Yes, thank you for that question, Orlando. Is there anyone who would like to respond? Heinz.
Well, of course, these recommendations are primarily focused on what the ministry can do to change power relations between northern and southern NGOs. But in a way, I think what you say, Orlando, is addressed when we talk about the agenda and priority setting, and when we start about that we say that we should start programs with programming from the south, that we recognize that you are most knowledgeable as a southern CSO about the intrinsic equalities in your country. And that's why it's so important that the agenda and priority settings should start with your organizations and not from the north. So I think that way, indirectly, we have addressed that issue and many other issues in which southern organizations are more knowledgeable and have more legitimacy than northern organizations.
Thank you, Heinz. Anyone else would like to respond?
Could I react to this?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, because I think it's very right what you say, Heinz, but at the same time, this is also the problem that we discussed in several interviews, because when agenda setting start from the south, and when from here we are going to work with organizations in the south, with which organizations are you going to work? Because there are, of course, all kind of also of inequalities, hierarchies in the countries itself. And one of the most significant things that were said about it was in my interview with Georgina of GNP Plus of the Love Alliance. She said, yes, this agenda setting, I of course, in principle, I very much like the idea. But at the same time, what will happen then to, for instance, key populations in the countries? Because maybe they will not be in a position to set the agenda because of the situation in the country itself and because of other parties that are more influential. So it is quite a tricky thing also to do, and we really need a lot of a lot of discussion about it. When we really want to bring this further, this agenda setting, you have to talk about legitimacy and representation, etc., and all these kind of things before it can really work. And then, of course, you really come across also inequalities in the countries.
Yes, thank you, Marijke. Orlando?
No, yes, I wanted to just point that how easy it is to make a group of population invisible. And it has to do with the relationships of power within the countries. And we are not talking about corruption, we are not talking about political instability and so on. And that has a huge impact in how the power of balance in the organizations in the country are established. And it's very difficult, I understand. It's very difficult to go to a country and try to navigate in all these different environments, but for that it's very important to work hand by hand with locals. But who to choose to work with is the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I read a quote this week, Orlando, that said, and that was more about service delivery type of work, but that said, the true measure of success of such interventions is not how many girls are now in school, how many arms have been injected, but whether power relations have been influenced. And I thought it was quite a powerful quote. Joseph, you raised your hand.
Hi, yeah, no, just following up on that conversation. I mean, I think we had quite a few discussions within our own alliance, and I think the one thing that is clear in this discussion is that when you're talking about Southern leadership, is that business as usual is always attracted to business as usual. So selection of partners is very much based on what the intention is. It's not something that can be solved on one side. I really like the comment by the interviewee who talked about how ready are Southern NGOs to lead. I mean, there's a framework, there's a structure that a lot of Southern NGOs are not able to fit into at the moment. So we need to question that structure. So I think it all starts with, if you're talking about, relating with the ministries, having very clear intentionality and knowing what is it we are seeking to change. If it's truly about, broadening the civic space and expanding those spaces, then the intentionality needs to start there, because that will then define the kind of partnerships that you attract in the Global South. If there is no clear intentionality around changing those power imbalances, then you will not lack for partners in the Global South who are like-minded, regardless of where you fall. So if there is no real intentionality to change the power relationships, then you will find partners in the Global South who, for their part, even within the countries, like Orlando was saying, are not interested in changing the power structures there. So to come in mid-program and expect things to change, it's like trying to change somebody's DNA when they're already a fully actualized person. It becomes very difficult. So I think if in the very initial stages of design, there is intentionality built into what one is seeking to do, and there's a clear understanding of where you sit, then it would be easier to kind of track how those changes are happening along the way. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to respond? Feel free to raise your hand. Or does anyone have a question?
Yeah, could I ask a question? My name is Sanne. I work for the Dutch Human Rights Network, and I understand that these recommendations that were discussed right now are really focused on the relationship between NGOs and organizations from the Global North and the Global South, and recommendations for strengthening the framework there. But to what extent were there also discussions among the focus group on other issues within the frameworks, like, for example, the focus countries that the ministry presents, or also the focus themes that the ministry has presented in the previous or in the current framework, because of course that also severely limits the space that organizations have to to continue the work that they do. And so I was wondering if that was at any point part of the discussions, or if there's a space to maybe raise some recommendations for that as well. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that question. I see Paul nodding. Paul, can I ask you to respond?
Yeah, I think that is part of the agenda setting chapter, right? Or the priority setting. You're right. I mean, in the current situation, also say Dutch priorities, Dutch interests are very strong when it comes to agenda setting. For example, a topic like migration or security and justice and terrorism is also very much in the interest of the Netherlands. And the same goes for the focus regions. I mean, these are regions where the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs see certain geopolitical interests for the Netherlands or EU. I don't say that is necessarily wrong, because I think we need to take into account that also the ministry, and again, it's taxpayers' money, so it makes sense that they also weigh these interests into the mix. But it leads to the fact that organizations that are part of the strategic partnerships are basically forced to buy into these interests that are a priori set by the government. So I think that is sort of, in a sense, already an issue, right? Because that will leave out. And I remember in the previous generation of partnerships, you even got a bonus if you proposed activities in these focus regions, and you were sort of punished if you included countries that were not part of the focus regions of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't think that is the right thing to do, right? Because that means that southern organizations working in these countries are not even able to be part of these kind of programs. So again, I think it should be more about joint agenda setting or joint priority setting instead of sort of top-down priority setting in which organizations can buy in. I don't think that's the right order.
Thank you for that response, Paul. I see Arnold is asking in the chat on next steps. We'll come to that in a minute, but maybe first discuss the question of Christina, who touches on the partnership model. So the MFA is not just a funder in this model, but is a partner in the partnership. I think it's a good question, Christina. Do you want to elaborate on it?
No, yeah, I think it is clear. And also in this discussion, we talk about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the donor, as the funder, as the ones who are setting the framework. But we have all signed a strategic partnership. And I'm wondering whether maybe also during the interviews that Marike had, but also in the team's reflection, whether there was also a reflection on how the partnership is shaped. And because that's also influencing, of course, the power shift. And I'm wondering, because I think that's also something we have to look into for the next framework. So I was wondering whether it has been a topic of the research as well.
Thank you for that question. Marijke, do you want to respond?
Yeah, and maybe also Josh, because I remember Josh also saying very interesting things on the one hand, the ministry with the partnership programs, and on the other hand, foreign policy with the embassies, whether they were really cooperative, etc. Would you like to say something about it, Josh, or should I go?
No, you can go ahead. I might add at the end if you miss out anything, but please go.
Well, you could always come in. Yes, it was indeed a topic in many interviews, For instance, also the interviewed I had, well, I think Carla also already made some remarks on it, but also Ruth, the last person who gave also her view on the Southern leadership, because she works in this in the alliance that has a lot to do with climate change, climate activists. And she said there is so much risk for these people who are doing the work. And then, yeah, now and then we have a talk with the ambassador, or we have a talk with people from Foreign Affairs. But sometimes we think, yeah, couldn't they do more? Or what is really the position that they take as being part, or as being a strategic partner? And that was missed, and not only there, but also in other partnerships. I heard it, and so it is a bit confusing that on the one hand there is this definition of being and also this profile of being a strategic partner, and on the other hand it is the donor. That's and especially the position of strategic partner is is a bit blurred now and then, let's say like that. You agree, Josh, or?
No, I fully agree, and I think this goes to the heart of the the expectations that are set. Because I mean, for our part, and look, in the different regions or countries we are working in, these are countries where you speak to the Dutch embassy, and they have a clear priority list. They've got a clear work agenda, and it's almost not surprising that it may not actually match what we need as a program in that particular country, or even resonate with the ability to strategically support the work that we are doing there. So it's a difficult one to figure out, because I mean, yes, the umbrella is that they all fall under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they seem to be slightly different hymn books. So you can brief all you like, but if in the 5-year period of duration of your program, none of what you do resonates with what the Dutch foreign policy in the country is, then it really doesn't work. I think I do not know what a possible solve to that would be. I mean, simplistically, one could say that once the countries are selected or the regions are selected, that there is a briefing that happens within the Dutch ministry that says we are going to be doing these in addition to the work that you're doing. Because if that discussion happened, then possible incongruencies could happen. I mean, if you're working in a country where there's the foreign policy objective is prevention of migration at any cost, for example, and some of the civic work that you're doing runs against that, then what trumps? The country program is left kind of floundering, wondering who are we speaking to and what we are doing. But it's just the reality of global politics and what needs to be done. So that shift from benevolent aid to understanding that this is an extension of foreign policy needs to be made clear, so that expectations are made and people know what to expect.
Thank you for that, Josh. I think we will then wrap up this part of the session, unless there's anything urgent anyone would like to say. No, then I will invite Heinz to discuss next steps.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you all for your very interesting feedback, and also this very interesting discussion. You're coming up with some topics that we also discussed in our group about the choice of topics and the choice of countries. We didn't really come up with a recommendation to that extent, but I think this discussion needs to be prolonged, because somehow we come from two sides and they have to meet somewhere, I think. So I also agree very much with what Paul had to say about that. It's still a Dutch policy, so Dutch priorities somehow have to also feature in there. About next steps, I've seen the Mentimeter. I think most, if not all, recommendations got a lot of support. But we don't want them just throw them over the fence to the ministry with a message, just do this. I think these are recommendations, they are not yet solutions. They are challenges, and I see them more like signposts indicating the direction in which we have to find solutions. And that's something that we would like to do together with the ministry, together also with the CSOs North and South. So what we are going to do in the near future is that we are going to organize on a thematic basis sessions in which we try to come from these recommendations to very concrete solutions that can be incorporated in the future policy. We still have time to do this, and we hope that many of you will be able to join in this process, and that also the ministry is willing to join in this process. We don't have a very clear agenda about that yet. We will discuss that in the next couple of weeks, and we'll let you know what the next steps are going to be exactly about. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Heinz. I see a question in the chat on the timing. Do we know timing on when we expect DEGIS to send a letter to Parliament to kick off the formal process? Is anyone able to respond to that question? Paul nods no. So then if Paul doesn't know, then I think I don't know about the timing yet.
No, I don't think it's a bit too early in the process now. So it's now very much internal conversations in the ministry. They're reaching out already a bit to organizations in the sector, but the process with Parliament will only start probably next year only.
Okay, thank you. Well, then I think we will close off this session. I'd like to extend a big thank you for taking the time to be here today with us and give your inputs and share your reflections. It really shows big support for this process. So thank you for that. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to Partos for leading this process, driving it, really taking on this very important role, and to everybody who has contributed to it. Heinz, Marijke, Sonja also for preparing this session. Thank you very much. And Sonja, I'd like to hand over to you to close off.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. Well, I think almost all have been said, but well, as Partos, also a big thank you to all the speakers and you for also your moderation, Esther. I do have to say that I think that all the recommendations that were being presented and the opinions of the different persons that reacted to it complemented each other perfectly, really nice, and provides really a lot of food for thought. Well, as Partos, we are committed to continue this journey of, well, creating a more balanced policy framework with the ministry and with you as a sector. Well, it has all been said. So thank you all for participating in this sector or in this session. And last but not least, if you are interested in well, some things that were mentioned at the beginning, the Partos Innovation Festival, the Feminist Mel session, just stay tuned and we'll have a look at our website every now and then. And well, thanks again for being here and have a nice day.